Hello and welcome. So this is an intro to TouchDesigner tutorial, and there are there's usually like a network is what they call it that's up when you open TouchDesigner for the first time. In order to get a blank screen, you can always just go up and say File, New, and create a new project, and that will, at least sometimes that will close the original one and then open a new copy, a blank file. So please go ahead and do that. And once you've done that, we'll look around the interface for a bit. So this empty space here that's got a grid is really where you're going to be doing all of your work. There's some menus, there's a palette over here, there's this thing that's totally blank here right now, but this is going to show us the parameters for each of our operators. And the way TouchDesigner works is that it creates, you create a bunch of what they call operators, which if you've used other node-based environments, they're called nodes, but in this case they're called operators, and they do some operation, right? Whether that's loading a video file or image file, or whether it's filtering it, or whether it's adding noise or whatever, right? It's this, you connect these things together. So to start, we're just going to go ahead and create some operators. And so to do that, you just double click anywhere in this area where you want an operator to go. I'm going to start up here in the corner. And I've double clicked, and then this OP create dialog pops up. And inside here, there's all of these purple options, right? And you'll notice at the top, there's a bunch of tabs. There's comp, top, chop, sop, right? Mat, dat, and custom. We're really going to be focusing on top, chop, and comp in this tutorial. And for the majority of the class that this is based on, that's what we're going to be working with. And really, we're just trying to get an introduction. I want to show you how to move around here. And then for students of the class, I'm providing several different like building blocks, little networks that you can riff on and build from. So to start with, we are going to create a video device in, because we're going to want to use the webcam. Now, if you don't have a webcam, we're also, the second thing we're going to do is we're going to create a video file in, or movie file in as they call it. And so we're going to go ahead, and to start, we're just going to say video device in. We're going to click, you'll see this white boundary around your mouse, and then you just place it wherever you want it. I'm going to drop it right here. And it took a second for it to load, but it did open my camera. As you can see, I'm kind of here. My laptop is off to the side. I'm using a different monitor, so I'm not quite centered, but that doesn't matter for this tutorial. If for some reason your video is not playing, I've had the issue where I didn't realize that the scene was paused. Note there is a play bar down here at the bottom. If it's paused when you create this, it'll just be a black screen and it won't load. So if you hit the play arrow, it should load. If that doesn't work, there's a good chance that this active is off instead of on. If I turn this off, you'll note I'm moving right now, but this is actually all it is it's got the last frame of video that was there before I turned it off. Now, if I turn this back on again, it'll go black and then it'll start working. Sometimes it can't find your camera, and I haven't had too many issues personally, but I know other people who have, or there's a driver issue with your camera. So if for some reason the camera isn't working, we're going to go ahead and create two other objects. They're going to be the exact same, they're going to be the same, but they're going to both be movie file in. So I'm going to double click, and I'm going to go and say, okay, movie file in is down here. Now, right, this interface is kind of hard to read because, right, it's like everything's on one level. By default, the cursor is already in the search bar. If I just hit MO, it'll gray out everything except, right, the ones that have those two characters starting. So that makes it a little bit easier to very quickly find what I'm looking for. So I'm going to create a movie file in. Now, you'll notice there's a banana in there. That's the default image that shows up in this thing. And before we go any further, what I'd like to do is copy this. So I have it highlighted in green. That means that this one's selected. I'm just going to hit Command or Control C and then Command or Control V, and it will paste it below it. So we have three sources here. And the reason I'm having three here is really we only need 2 for what we're going to do. But the third one is in case you have no access to your video camera, I want you to have some other source there. So in my case, I'm going to select this movie file in 2, and I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to hit the plus sign by this parameter, right? There's each object has different parameters. So in this case, right, this has, the file option and whether I want it to play, crossfade, blah, 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 blah. If I go up to the video end, you'll see there's other options here that are slightly different. We're not going to worry about those right now. And you'll note that there are also several different tabs. If I click on the image tab, it's got more settings and things. We're not going to worry about any of that except to hit the plus sign here, which is going to allow us to open some other image file. Now, this is all in, we're just going to use assets from TouchDesigner. And so it's already dropping me into that folder that has all the TouchDesigner assets. So I'm just going to grab, I don't know, one of these butterflies. It doesn't matter. You could do something else. In fact, instead of doing that, let's go ahead and just grab, let's see if they have another MOV file in here somewhere. That would work. No, they just have, let's just do the clock. That's fine, the count. So we're just going to click on count.mov. It may be MP4, depending on if you're on Windows. I'm not exactly sure if they do the same thing. You could also just grab any video or image file from your computer, and you can see that now that is playing, right? As long as this is not paused, that is playing. If I go ahead, also the space bar pauses and plays, right? The whole scene. And so I've got my video sources ready to go. So now, right, the thing about TouchDesigner is we can do real-time filters, real-time editing, real-time interaction. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to create something where, let's say we want to be able to switch between these 3 sources. So surprisingly enough, there is a operator called switch. So if I double click and come over here and hover switches over here, I could also type in SW. It would get rid of everything. These are at least in alphabetical order, which is nice. So I'm going to go ahead and click switch. And I'm going to create this switch. Now what switch does is any input video sources or images, it will allow you to switch between those 3 or 2 or 5 or however many you want to put in there. So we're going to start by connecting these. And the way we connect these is you start with the object you want to connect. And you just click and drag on that little empty space, and you can drop it in here. And now you'll see that this video source is feeding in here. So now to get the second one in there, I just do the exact same thing. And you'll see that this is, on top, there's a little gap, then there's this one, and I can drop this one. And you'll notice, right, at this point, nothing's happening, right? It's just that video of me talking to you. So let's go ahead and grab this. And if we have the switch selected, you can see there's this index value. Now, in many things, when you see an index, it's usually an integer value, but this slider is actually a floating point, right? It has decimals. So I can actually, until I can slide forward. And then once I get to 1, you'll see it switches to a banana. If I get a little bit further along, right, to 2, it switches to the 3rd video. And then if I scroll all the way up to 10, right, nothing else happens, right? Because I'm really only using these 3 indices, right? 0, 1, and 2. And I want you to note that the only other option on here is whether or not I want to blend between these 2 inputs. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. And that's why the index is a float. That's why it's a floating point value, is because it allows me to fade gracefully between these different sources, which is kind of a cool option to have just by default, that we don't have to create anything extra to make that happen. Something else to note, the middle mouse button, or if you're using a trackpad, 2 fingers together, at least on the Mac, allows you to zoom in and out on your object, so you can make this reasonably close to full screen. If you click and drag anywhere in the grid, that will move your entire scene around. If you hover over one of these operators and click and drag, that will actually move the operator. And if you do the 3rd click, that will allow you to select multiple objects. You can also select multiple objects by holding Shift on the keyboard and clicking and dragging. And I believe Command click, yes, just Command click allows you to drag the scene around. And Option click, I would think would be a nice way to do zooming in and out, but it does not like to do that. So, okay, so we can dolly in, we can dolly out, we can move around our scene. They made the interface pretty simple and easy to understand, which is great. Okay, so we're switching sources. That's fantastic. So now let's say we want to start applying some filters to it. Now, there's a lot of different possibilities, and if you've used Photoshop or Illustrator or some other image editing program or After Effects or Premiere, you're probably going to recognize some of these options. So if I go ahead and double click, the one I'm going to do, because it's just like really obvious, is Edge, but you'll notice Emboss is there as well. There's Lens Distort, Luma Blur, Blur. Up at the top, there's Multiply. You can create a normal map. We're not going to worry about that yet. But you can switch color spaces. There's a lot of things that may look very familiar. And so we're going to start by doing edges. So I'm going to click on Edge. I'm going to drop this over here, and then I'm just going to go ahead and take my source and drop it into this edge. And I'm going to zoom in on this a bit so you can see what's happening. So what this does is, right, it's highlighting it's looking for edges, it's finding edges, and then it's highlighting those edges. And you can see that it's, found a whole bunch of different edges. And you'll also notice that this is on this grid. Now, the way that this works is it's highlighting this, but anything that's not visible right now is black. If I turn this comp over input on, you'll see that, right, it kind of shows you what it's doing on top of the video that I've got. And it's kind of a gorgeous, I don't know, like sketchy look, even just as it is. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. If I say alpha, if this alpha setting here, if I say 1, right, that's actually just going to fill in the background with black, right? If I say 0, then, right, it basically does the same thing as Edge. Okay, it's a little bit different. You can kind of see, right, there's like some slight variation there, but we're going to leave it at the default edge. And then there's some settings you can adjust here. Like first, if we increase the black level, that basically means it's pushing the threshold up, so less edges will come through, right? It's going to be more selective in what it chooses to make an edge around. If I increase the strength, what that's going to do is it basically brightens and thickens the lines, right? So if I really crank this up, you can see those ceiling tiles have some really interesting things happening in there in terms of the edges, right? It's really amping that up significantly. I'm going to turn that down just a little bit and maybe turn the black level up just a touch. The other thing I can do is I can set my edge color. So I can go in here and I could just be like, ooh, I really want these to be like vibrantly neon green because that, I don't know, looks cool or something. The sample steps, I don't know. I mean, you can kind of see what that does. In this case, it's really like softening things a little bit. It makes it less pixelated, a little bit smoother and softer. It's one of those things where you can just adjust the aesthetic of what you're working on. And you get to adjust those steps, the vertical and horizontal steps independently. The other option at the very top is what you're choosing to use to make those choices. So you can either use luminance, which is the brightness of the image, right? It basically evaluates it as though it's a black and white image, and the brighter, and if it sees a difference between luminance above a certain threshold, it's going to say that's an edge. The same thing holds true, but these are all the individual channels. If I do alpha, nothing's going to happen in this option because, right, there is no alpha channel on my video. Alpha is transparency and the whole thing's opaque. However, if I zoom out a little bit and I come back to my switch and I slide this index up to the banana, you'll see that suddenly, and I'm just going to leave it here somewhere in the middle, you'll see that suddenly I just have this outline of a banana, and that's because the banana does have an alpha channel, right? It's a banana on a transparent background. And so I'm able to use that option here. But because it's not going to work for every single one of our options, let's just go ahead and go back to luminance. And now I want you to note that because my slider wasn't exactly on 1, I'm actually getting some of that crossover of that other thing. So now it looks like it's like a banana countdown timer, which, makes me really happy. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that in its current state. If you want to match that, the index on the switch is set to 1.3. Okay, so this is cool and all, but let's say that I do want to composite this. Now, right, I can actually composite this over the existing image, the input image, automatically. And that's a really great option, but I want to show you the composite thing and how we can start to merge video sources. Okay, so if we want to composite this on top of this in the more long way, what we can do is we can create another network or another operator. There are a couple options we have. If you hover over the output of this, and you can right click on it, and then when you go ahead and create surprisingly enough, a composite operator, it automatically has that connection made, that network connection made to the base object. So if I click on this, right now I've got this set up, it's already connected. But let's go ahead and say we want to comp from the switch into here with this other object. So if I go ahead and click and drag, I can drop this in here. And now I've got these two inputs in my composite, right? If I have this selected and highlighted in green, I've got these two options. And you'll notice it tells me what order these are in. And you'll also see that, right, it's like it doesn't look great. In part, that's because we're using the multiply operation. And so anything that is black is going to get multiplied against any other color will turn black. One thing we could try is switching the order of these two inputs. So if I click on this up arrow, that should push this up one. And you'll note that didn't really make any difference in the way that this is set at this point. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to change our operation. If we just do a top, you'll note that now I'm getting some of the color information from the switch, it mixed in with the edge. Let's go ahead and switch this and flip these around again. Okay, right. So now I've more or less got the same output as I would have had if I had this comped, if I turn that comp switch on in the edge. Right, so we've got this set up. That's great. If you pop this open, you'll notice there are all sorts of different blend modes. If I do freeze, I'm going to get, something kind of interesting there. Overlay, and let's see if we switch this again, right? Each one of these, when you do this, especially if you have two layers, sometimes it's nice to just see what happens when you mix these together. Maximum, outside luminance isn't going to help me any. Dodge might be interesting. I'm not really getting, super cool things happening in here yet, but we'll look at some other examples in a second. But, subtractive, you start to see some color changes happening. And again, it just really depends on how this is set up. Soft light, where's our screen? Okay, so we've got that set. Let's go ahead and change our source a little bit here. And we can scale back down into somewhere between a banana and this. And you can see that, right, we've got these two sources composited together. Now, with composites, we can composite multiple inputs. You'll notice that I actually have three things listed on here at this current point. Oh, sorry, that's on the switch. I have the wrong thing selected. Yeah, so I still have just two inputs here. We can put more inputs in here and it'll comp them all together. Like if you want to add three things together, you can do that. Let's go ahead and pull in another source. But what we're going to do is we're going to comp whatever we've done here with something else. So let's go ahead and look at some of the other effects that we can do. So if I want to, we're going to go over here to our palette. And if we click on this image filters option, which this may be closed up, and if it is, just open it up, select image filters. If we go down here, you'll see there's this bloom option, which down below there's an icon that kind of shows you what it does. And then there's info. Sometimes there's text, sometimes there's not. The one we're going to do is we're going to do this feedback edge, just because it's like really very apparent that it's doing something crazy to what you're working on. So if I say feedback edge and I pull this out here, you'll see that by default it has, if I zoom in, you can kind of see that this is like some tall like prairie grass blowing in the breeze or something like that. And what this does is it's basically like finding edges and then applying some feedback. So it's like running through the through that same video over and over again and layering it. But if I go ahead and just grab my video device in and drag down here, you'll note that first, right, I can have multiple outputs. And two, right, I've got this really crazy input happening. If I come over here, you'll note that I have these options for different source tint, edge color, source gain, edge strength, etc. A bunch of stuff that we can do here. We can hue shift. I'm going to go ahead and change this edge color to something that's, wow, that's kind of crazy. That's blue. I'm going to increase the edge strength some so that it gets a little bit more blue. You'll see it's a little bit intensely bright. I can increase or decrease the scale. That kind of changes like how things move. This is just like I don't know. I can reduce the amount of blur on my feedback so you can kind of see that a bit more closely. I can increase the gain on the feedback or decrease the gain, which might actually be useful. You can see I can, there we go. Right, so I'm just trying to get a little something going here. And the source gain, let's pull that down to, there we go. Right, so I'm just trying to get a bit more animation happening in the background. And you can see it does some really crazy things. But now I can go in and I can drag this over and I can say like, well, I really want to composite both of these things together because I want stuff to get weird. So I'm going to go ahead and double click, create another composite, take the output of the first composite, drop it in here, take the output of the feedback edge, drop it in here. And then you'll note that that doesn't look very interesting at all. I can barely see what's happening. And again, that's because this is set to multiply, which kind of deadens most things. It can be really useful in certain settings, but right now it's not so hot. If I was to say luminance difference, however, suddenly I get a much more potentially interesting result. I can also go here and, we could try linear light. That's kind of crazy. Right, and this is where things start to get a bit more fun because we have, freeze is really cool to me. I don't know why, but we can try heat as well. Sure, that looks great. Right, so we're able to do, right, all of these different settings and, get things to, be basically applying effects in real time on video as it's happening, which is pretty great if you've been, if you've used Premiere or After Effects in the past. That you have to render all of that stuff in order for it to actually apply the effects. And so it's, the feedback loop is longer and and you can't really do anything in real time. So we've got this set. This is fantastic. Let's go ahead and make this patch a little bit more interactive. So one of the first things we're going to want to do is I'd like to be able to, let's just say I want to be able to sweep through the hue. And I'm choosing these options because they make it easy to show you the processes with like a very quick visual result. So what we're going to do that is we need to create an object that will allow us to adjust the hue, saturation, and vibrance. So if I double click over here and I'm in here, you'll see that there's RGB to HSV, but that's not what I want. What I actually want is over here is the HSV adjust, hue, saturation, vibrance adjust. And I think I said brightness before. It depends on what software you're using. Sometimes they refer to it as vibrance, sometimes as brightness. I'm going to go ahead and click on HSV adjust, put this here, drag this in here, and it should look identical to start with. And you'll note there's all sorts of different possible options here. The one that we're going to be focused on is this hue offset. If I click and drag on that, you'll see that, right, the colors in my video, right, change. And I'm sure you've all done like some sort of hue shift thing previously, right? It's a pretty common effect to see people do on videos, because honestly, it's really easy to do. But so you'll notice that this value goes from 360 degrees to negative 360 degrees, right? And 360 and negative 360 and 0 are all the same, right? It's a circle. But it allows you to cycle through these. Now, the thing is, like, now we want to be able to cycle through this, and we want to be able to adjust it. Maybe not within here. Maybe we want to create something where we'd have this set sort of as an interface, and people could maybe move some sliders, move some knobs, do some things like that. So we're going to go ahead and start doing some interaction that way. So to start, we're going to go ahead and double click. And this time we're not going to choose a top. We're going to choose a comp. And comp is where there's lots of different things in here we're not going to talk about right now. But under this like dark gray panels option, one of the options here is slider. So let's go ahead and do a slider. And these are all these panel things are meant for input. Like if you have some sort of input or interface you're trying to build to control stuff, that's what this is for. So I'm going to click on the slider and I'm going to drop this down. Now you'll notice, even though it's like that black gray color, it actually has a green output. Now when it has a green output, I can't take a green output and put it into a purple input. It will not allow me to do that. And so there has to be a different way that we're going to be accessing this, the value of the slider. You'll also note that right now, if I click and drag on the object, I move it around, I can't move the slider itself. There is this little button down here that looks kind of like a star to me. If I click on that little star in the bottom right corner, that locks the object in place and allows me to adjust the slider. Now, right, so I've got the slider, I can move it from one side to the other. If I go over here to the parameter panel, or dialog or whatever they call it, and click on the slider option, you'll notice there's a lot of things here. We're not worried about any of them, but you'll see the value here, and I can click on this and it will actually increase and decrease. And you'll notice that this goes from 0 to 1. Now that's an issue for us because, right, if we remember our hue offset, we want to be able to go from negative 360 to positive 360. If we just went from 0 to 1, we would not see any change whatsoever. So we need to be able to basically scale the output of this up or change the range, which to something else. And to do that, what we're going to do is first we're going to click on this viewer active button. We're going to turn that off so that we can actually get output out of here. And if I right click on here, and I'm going to go up to math. And I know math is scary to some folks. We're not going to be doing much in the way of math right now. We're going to be, but I do want you to notice that once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and click on this viewer active. And if I slide this, you'll see I get a value change in that window as well. That's fantastic. And this is called a channel. You can have many different channels in objects. Even this math operator, I could have like 3 sliders in here. If I wanted them all to have the same range or whatever, or have the same operation done to them. In our case, what we're going to do is we're going to select the math. And you'll note that there's several options here. We're not going to worry about combining any of this. We're not doing any of those things right now. And we're not going to do this pre-add or multiply or post-add. All we're going to do is we're going to go to range. And there's a from range, which is 0 to 1, which matches what our slider is. And then there's the range we want this to be mapped to. In our case, right, that's going to be negative 360. So I'm just typing this in. I'm going to come over here, click on that, delete that one, and make it positive 360, right? So now if I clicked on that, you'll notice already there's a change here where it says it's at 90. So if I click and drag, I should go up to 360, and I should go all the way down to negative 360. Great, so I've got my range. So now how the heck do I connect this to this? Because, right, I can't send this green edge in here. The way I do that is to start with the easiest thing to do is make the viewer active on the math object, right? Because now you'll see if I hover over this, the screen turns green and I have this caret symbol that pops up that is basically telling me I'm going to be able to grab this channel, and there's only one channel right now, but I'm going to be able to drag this and apply it somewhere else. So now what I need to do is I need to select the object that I want to apply that channel to, and I want to have that highlighted. And this is the thing that I want to control, is the hue offset. Now there's a couple different ways I can do this, and I just want you to note there's this little plus sign here. If I pop this open, this shows like several different ways you can control this. You can actually, this one is just the constant, which is whatever value we've set in this dialog. This blue thing is an expression, right? So it's basically a little bit of code that you can write to change it. So we could write some code that would change this over time. There's also this export option, and this is the export. This is what we're going to be using, but you'll see it says export not found right now. We're just going to go back to constant, and we're actually going to close this up because you don't even need that open. I just wanted to show you some of those options. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hover over the math. We're going to click drag. If I just click, it potentially will select it, but we want to click drag, and we want to drag this up. And we can either drop it on the word hue offset, or we can drop it in this gray box here. And when we do that, this little menu pops up, and we want to say export chop. And when we do export chop, now you'll already notice the color is slightly different from theirs there. Now if I click and drag, now I have control in real time of this through something that could be part of an interface at a later step. All right, that's pretty fantastic. Ooh, it's so exciting. Okay. So what do we need to do now? All right. Okay. So let's say that, aside from this being interactive, let's say that we actually want to be able to control this. Maybe we want something to be able to be slid, and we want something else to be controlled over time, right? So we don't want to control it. We just want it to oscillate through a value range. And so let's look at some of these other settings here. I'm going to try, and I guess they call it value. Oh, that's kind of nice. Let's zoom in a little bit here. And let's see what that looks like. Where is it? Value range. Okay, right. This does something interesting to it. So we're going to go ahead and control this parameter with our through an oscillator. And what we're going to do is we're going to create an object called a LFO, or a low frequency oscillator. And to do that, we're going to double click here in space. We're going to come over, we're going to be in the chop menu, which is the channel operator is what they call it. The tops are more, I honestly don't know what the T stands for. I always forget, but basically it's for video, for anything that's like in a matrix, that's like got X and Y values. But so the chop, we're going to come down here. We are going to find the LFO, which of course is hiding behind my bar there. So I'm going to go ahead and click on LFO. I'm going to drop this down, and you'll see that automatically there is this slider between -1 and 1 that is just going back and forth, right? And so we don't want this to go from -1 to 1, I don't think, although we could try it and just see what happens, because sometimes you can do things beyond the range. So if I was to actually set this range right here to -1, that'll let us know if it does anything. No, it doesn't. It just terminates at 0. So what we're going to do is select our LFO, and there are several different types. Now we can do something. There's things we could do. We could either offset this because right now it's centered on 0 and it's going from -1 to 1. If I was to offset this to, let's just say 1, I want you to see what happens to this value, right? So now it's 1, so now it's going from 0 to 2, right? So it's going from 0 to 2, but I know that I believe if I go to my value range and set this to 2, I think I'm going to get the same effect where it's just going to revert to 1. right? Because the value range is only going 0 to 1. So that means I need to come back to my LFO, and my amplitude determines, right, how tall it is, right? And so if it's an amplitude of 1 and it's a sine wave, it's going to be going from, that means that at the peak it would be at 1, at the or 2, center is at 1, and then it goes to 0, right? And so if we made our amplitude half as tall, so 0.5, then we should be going, well, we're not going from 0 to 1. We're actually going from, right, 0.5 to whatever, because my offset is 1. If I adjust my offset down to 0.5 as well, I should now be going, there we go, from 0 to more or less 1. And it's hard to see the 1 when you get there, but if you're paying attention, you can see it go. The other thing is the frequency, right? This is a pretty fast rate. So let's go ahead and set our frequency to 0.5 as well. Now you'll notice that slows that down significantly. We could probably go even slower. Let's just do 0.2. And you'll see that it very slowly creeps through these values. Okay, so we've got that set. So let's go ahead and take this output and we're going to bring it in here. So what we'll do is we're going to make our viewer active, right? That thing's going to be green. We're going to select this. We're going to make sure, all right, value range is the one we want. We're going to click drag and drop this right on here and say export chop. And so now we've got, right, those values changing over time. And you'll note like, oh, maybe that's a little bit slower than I'd like it. But maybe I want this to be a little bit faster. So in that case, I would need to click on my viewer active to turn it off, select this, and I could say, okay, well, let's make the frequency 0.5 again and see if that's like, you know, yeah, that's not too fast. That's a good rate. Okay, so now is a great time to save what we've been doing. So I'm going to hit Command or, well, actually, before I save it, I'm going to go to say File. I'm going to say Create Project Folder. The reason that you want to create a project folder, and I'm going to put this someplace special, well, TouchDesigner examples. All right, great. And I'm going to hit Open, and then I'm going to name it, you know, video intro toot, something like that. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Create in just a second. But what it does is it'll save the file as that, and it creates a folder structure where you can drop audio files in, movie files in, images, etc., into different folders. And so all of your assets are together because, right, with TouchDesigner, all you're doing is you're telling it to grab these video sources or grab these images and then do something with them. It doesn't actually, the TOE file, the actual TouchDesigner file doesn't have any, it doesn't have those source files attached to it unless you create the project folder and save things. So if you're moving it from computer to computer, things can get lost. This keeps your file structure in a really good place. So we're going to create this, and we're going to go ahead and save it. And you'll see there's all these different folders in here now. Okay, so I've saved this. Now, with the little simple things that I've showed you, you could go ahead and create other LFOs, create more sliders, attach them to math objects, adjust the range, and control all sorts of settings in here. At this point, it would be good to take some time and experiment with like, well, what happens if I add, you know, more filters to this? Let's go ahead and go to, let's just say HSV to RGB. And we're just going to pull this in, right? That just alone creates a really intense variation in our colors. And then, right, there's no settings to adjust here. It's just a conversion. Right, but we could say, oh, well, maybe we want to actually composite this with this. So let's go ahead and create a new comp. And I'm going to drop this in as one source and move my scene a bit, drop this in as another source. Note that when I only have one source in there, I get that red X. And that basically just means something is wrong. Now I've got both of these sources together. Let's not do multiply. Let's do like difference or something. Right, and so now I've got an even more bizarre change. You might even, and I haven't tried this, but I have a feeling that you could potentially, I don't know if, I assume these have values that are, numeric, and you might be able to use a slider to slide and the math object to slide between all of these. I'm not 100% sure of that. Right. But yeah, so there's, so you can test all these different, options here. That's kind of weird. But you can see that very quickly with TouchDesigner, you can create significantly like layered and kind of crazy things. And if we were applying, some other filters and adjusting things, we could, create a lot of really interesting stuff. Now, if you wonder how an object works, in some cases, some of these things in the palette won't have examples, but most of the ones from the main operator dialog, the create operator dialog, do. And so what you do is if you right click on this, on any one of them, I'm going to right click on the hue, saturation, adjust. You'll notice that in this case, there's no operator snippets for this, right? It's just turned off entirely. So if I go and try this comp, you'll see that there are operator snippets. And if I click on this, it's going to open another window, another patch. And let's see if I can, and when I do that, it opens up this window, and it doesn't matter that composite is empty, at least in that one. Here we go. This is, there's this set, right? All blend modes. I don't know where this patch went. It's gone, but that's all right. But this, right, shows you different things, and they've just renamed the composite, the different mode that they're using. Right. And you can say, and they have many inputs. And so you can kind of see what that looks like. Translate step, right? In this case, right, they've just created these constant color fields, and they've actually comped it together, but it's like stacked. So there's a lot of really interesting things that you can do with this. You'll note that this is just this one object, and you're like, well, what is that? If you zoom in far enough in any object, it actually pops into that object, that operator, and then you can see the network that creates that effect, right? And so in this case, there's like, right, there's a lot of stuff in here, and if I just keep zooming out, eventually I will pop back out of that. So let's go ahead and just close this and go back to our thing. Some of these, like if I go into comp, it's not going to go any further, right? And that means that I can't get any deeper than that. However, this feedback edge is actually a network that's doing this, that's being output. So if I zoom into feedback edge, you can actually see the way that they created this effect, which is kind of really awesome. Something else to note, if you zoom too far out on your network, it's going to pop you into this project pane. And if you get here and you're like, what happened? All you got to do is zoom back in. I think it's a really nice way of working. One last thing that's pretty awesome is if you want to see one of these large, you can click, there's usually this like light blue circle. If you can do it, you click on that and it actually makes it the background of your network. So you can have like a more full screen view while you're working on your network of this particular object. Okay, so that should be a pretty good intro. Go ahead and play, mix things up, mash things up, break things, try and get buttons to work. But hopefully this introduces you to the interface.